After studying this module, you shall be able to know the meaning of elderly abuse, understand the factors associated with physical safety of the elderly, describe the external and internal risk factors of physical safety, identify the risk factors of elderly abuse, and analyze the meaning and signs of financial vulnerability among elderly. The elderly population constantly faces risk factors in relation to their safety and security. Owing to their diminishing physical and cognitive capacities, the elderly become more and more vulnerable to safety issues, both physical and financial. It is widely known that the demographic pyramid has been showing reverse trends, indicating that the population of elderly in relation to the younger population is constantly and gradually increasing. Elderly population has been identified as a social category of persons who need specialized attention. The elderly individuals require assistance and special care in a number of ways, as a result of which the governments all over the world have formulated special policies for their welfare. The kinds of risk factors faced by the elderly population on a daily basis are quite different from the risk factors faced by the younger generations. With advancing age, people lose their previous skill and capacity level, as a result of which their independence gets diminished. They become dependent on others for their day-to-day survival needs. This responsibility is majorly taken up by their adult children or other family members. But in many instances, the primary caregivers become negligent or abusive towards the elderly, which compromises the safety of the elderly. This safety issue is just one among the many such challenges faced by the elderly. This module outlines the numerous safety concerns of the elderly in contemporary scenario, along with the vulnerability of the elderly in terms of abuse and financial security. Factors of physical safety. According to data from World Population Prospects, the 2015 revision of United Nations 2015, the population of the elderly people, those with 60 years of age or more, has increased considerably in recent years in most countries. This growth is expected to steadily grow in the coming decades. Safety becomes one of the many major concerns when working with or providing care to older persons. Although older adults compose approximately 12.5% of the total world population, according to World Population Prospects, the 2015 revision, they account for approximately 23% of accidental deaths. This data clearly indicates the physical vulnerability of the elderly. A report from the National Safety Council of the United States reveals that approximately 24,000 people older than 65 years die from accidental injuries each year. Apart from that, the report also revealed that at least 8 lakh sustain physical injuries serious enough to disable them for at least one day. These statistics are alarming and bring to our attention the severity of safety and security issues of the elderly. The elderly face a number of safety problems on a daily basis, with falls, burns, accidental poisoning, and automobile accidents being the most common. Apart from that, exposure to temperature extremes in the absence or negligence of caregivers also places older adults at risk for injury or death. The elderly are more susceptible to accidents and injuries than are younger adults because of a number of internal and external factors. Internal factors are associated with their own being and include the normal physiological changes which accompany aging, increased incidence of chronic disease, increased use of medications, and cognitive or emotional changes. External factors are constant and are associated with the environment in which the elderly dwell and include a variety of environmental factors that present hazards to older adults. The following section outlines some of these internal and external factors which pose serious risk to the physical safety of the elderly people. External risk factors. These are the factors which are embedded in the physical surroundings of the elderly individuals and pose a threat to their physical safety. Environmental hazards include everything that surrounds older persons from day to day. Potential hazards are presented by not only the people surrounding them, but also the variety of objects a person comes into contact with on a daily basis. In addition, even the climate in which the elderly person lives can present an environmental threat. Environmental hazards which threaten the physical safety of the elderly are everywhere: in the home they reside in, on the street, in public buildings, and surprisingly even in the healthcare settings. Although injuries often occur in the home, any change in environment such as hospitalization, travel, or any other move from a familiar environment increases the likelihood of injury for older adults. The most common among the external risk factors have been identified. First, fire hazards. It is not surprising to know that the elderly individuals are among the highest risk groups for injury or death due to fire hazard. Various institutions and establishments involved with elderly care, such as hospitals and long-term care facilities, do take note of the danger of fire. The building requirements for these institutions recommend safety doors, fire extinguishers, exit windows, oxygen precautions, and other safety measures which ensure that the elderly are not exposed to risk due to fire hazards. Second, home security. People attempting to enter a house, particularly strangers, present a risk to the elderly. Older adults are more vulnerable than younger persons to attack and injury from those strangers or intruders who prey on weaker or more defenseless people, such as the infirm or elderly. Older adults need to be aware of the risks presented by strangers and learn to institute measures to reduce the likelihood of injury. Unknown people attempting to trespass into their house or intruding without permission with the intent of causing harm are especially likely to look for easy targets, such as the elderly, against whom it is relatively easy to use physical force. This presents a major safety risk for the elderly people, who thus become highly vulnerable to physical assault, burglary, armed robbery, or physical attack. Third, vehicular accidents. Another major risk factor for the physical safety of the elderly involves vehicular accidents. Motor vehicles pose a risk for the elderly in a number of ways. Motor vehicle accidents are more likely to occur with aging, whether the older person is a pedestrian or a driver. In case the elderly person is a pedestrian, crossing roads is a significant problem for them. When it comes to driving, the elderly individuals are often unwilling to stop driving in spite of the serious risks to themselves and others. Independence is one of the major reasons expressed by elderly adults for continued driving, as they refuse to become dependent on someone else for their everyday mobility. Nevertheless, the elderly pose a threat to themselves as well as others by insisting on continuing to drive. Several factors contribute to this. Age-related vision changes result in a number of changes which compromise their driving ability. These include altered depth perception, changes in night vision, and diminished ability to recover from glare. Hearing changes can also interfere with the ability to recognize sirens or other auditory warnings. Apart from this, other changes such as decreased muscle strength, reduced flexibility, and slower reflexes reduce the ability to respond to hazards while controlling a motor vehicle. To top that, various medical conditions or medications prescribed for these medical conditions may also have adverse effects on driving ability. Internal risk factors. When it comes to the physical safety issues of the elderly, it is not only the external factors which pose a risk, but also a number of internal factors associated with their being. It has majorly to do with the physical changes accompanying the process of aging. For example, vision and hearing are considered to be protective senses. When the acuteness of the sense diminishes with age, the risk for injury gets increased. Changes in the senses of vision and hearing are common with aging. The common changes include a diminished range of peripheral vision and changes in depth perception. These changes can interfere with the ability of older persons to judge the different aspects of their physical environment. For example, due to diminished senses, they might incorrectly judge the distance and height of stairs and curbs, etc. in their house, or fail to correctly determine the position and speed of motor vehicles. Another major change involves diminished night vision. As a result, in dim light or glare, older adults may be unable to see that a threshold, step, or other obstacle is present. They may be unable to see or read stationary road signs that provide directions or warnings. As a result, falls or motor vehicle accidents might occur. Additionally, changes in visual acuity make it more difficult for the elderly to read labels with small print, such as labels on prescriptions or medical supplements. This in turn makes it difficult for them to read the directions or suggested dosage on prescribed medicines. Many older adults then become susceptible to take incorrect medications or wrong doses or even consume poisonous substances because of their inability to see adequately to read the labels. Decreased auditory acuity reduces an older person's ability to detect and respond appropriately to warning calls, whistles, or alarms. For example, older adults may not hear a warning call of impending danger, may not hear a motor vehicle or siren in time to avoid an accident, or may not respond to a fire alarm in time to leave a building safely, ultimately resulting in serious injury. The senses of smell and taste also help protect us from consuming substances that might be harmful to the body. Decreased sensitivity of these senses increases the risk for accidental food or chemical poisoning in the elderly population. Apart from this, the elderly people often experience one or more physiological changes that increase their risk for accidental injuries or threaten their physical safety. Any of these changes alone or in combination can reduce the older person's ability to respond quickly enough to prevent an accidental injury. When these problems are combined with chronic diseases or health problems, the risk increases dramatically. Another set of internal factors that are most likely to contribute to safety problems among elderly are associated with the health conditions related to cardiovascular, nervous, and musculoskeletal systems. Any cardiovascular disease that affects normal cardiac output and reduces the supply of oxygen to the brain can result in the elderly person to feel vertigo or dizziness and fainting. Elderly people with neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease or stroke experience weakness, and consequently their way of walking and balancing show variations which increase the risk of tripping over. In addition to that, major neurological and circulatory changes can also decrease the ability to sense painful stimuli or temperature changes, enhancing the chances for tissue damage, burns, or frostbite. Musculoskeletal system diseases such as arthritis or osteoarthritis further reduce free movement in joints and flexibility. This readily decreases the ability of the elderly to move and promptly respond to hazards, further increasing the likelihood of accidents or injury. Medical prescriptions often contribute to accidental injuries, and because elderly people commonly take one or more medications at the same time, their risk for untoward effects is increased. Any medical prescription that alters sensation or perception or slows reaction time or causes orthostatic hypotension is potentially dangerous for the elderly. There are numerous such medications, the common ones being sedatives, hypnotics, tranquilizers, diuretics, etc. Cognitive changes or emotional disturbance and depression may be overlooked as risk factors for falls or injury. These disturbances reduce an older person's ability to recognize and process information. Distracted or preoccupied older adults are less likely to pay full attention to what is happening or what they are doing. This lack of attention and caution increases the risk for accidents and injury. Falls. The most common among the accidental injuries experienced by the elderly include falling or tripping over. In other words, falls are the most common safety problems in older adults due to a number of physiological changes, as outlined before, which limit their physical acuity and senses. The elderly individuals tend to experience frequent falls. Some of these falls turn out to be quite severe and enough to disable the elderly for a few days or even longer in serious cases. What is noteworthy about falls is that the older a person becomes, the more likely he or she is to suffer serious consequences, such as hip fracture from a fall. The problem gets compounded because many independent elderly are unwilling to report a fall because of the implication that they are frail and dependent. In addition to causing physical damage, falls take a psychological toll on the elderly. This causes them to lose confidence in their physical capacity and decrease mobility, which is unfortunate because early recognition and interventions can reduce the risk for further falls. A number of safety measures can be adopted to reduce the number of falls. The primary measure is to identify hazards in their home environment. Creating awareness among the elderly and their family members about things they can do to reduce the risk for falls goes a long way in preventing falls. In order to address the issue of falls, the older individuals should be encouraged to move at a comfortable pace and to not hurry. This is because hurrying but increases the risk of falling. They should be encouraged to wear comfortable footwear that helps with support and balance. Assistive devices that improve stability by providing a wider base of support, example canes and walkers, should be used. Environmental modification also helps in reducing the risks. To prevent falls resulting from visual deprivation, staircases should be well lit both during day and night. The edges of stairs, shower lips, and any other elevations should be marked using a dark or contrasting color stripe to help the elderly recognize the edge. Hallways should be fitted with strong grip rails to provide support. All obstructive material such as newspapers, waste baskets, shoes and other clutter should be removed from the floor. Elderly abuse. Definition and meaning of elderly abuse. The abuse of elderly people by caregivers, family members, or ill-willed strangers is not an uncommon phenomenon. This was not, however, a well-recognized conception until recently. As the initiatives to address child abuse and domestic violence began to be taken seriously in the last quarter of the 20th century, abuse of the elderly remained a private matter, hidden from the public view. Initially seen as a social welfare issue and eventually a problem of aging, abuse of the elderly, like other forms of family violence, has now developed into a public health and criminal justice issue. As elderly people become more physically fragile, they become unable to resist and counter maltreatment meted out to them. They are unable to fight back if physically attacked. Their senses get weakened, as a result of which they fail to detect warning signs. Their cognitive skills also get diminished, as a result of which they are not able to think as clearly as they used to before. This gives an opportunity to devious people to take advantage of them. The concept of elderly abuse was first described in British journals in 1975 under the term granny battering. The research was further undertaken in many countries across the globe. Owing to the socio-cultural conditions of living unique to every country, the research findings yielded different kinds of results. The instances of elder abuse were first identified in developed countries, but gradually such instances came to light in other countries as well, indicating that this was a universal phenomenon. Elder abuse is being regarded in earnest as a consequence of the realization that in the coming decades there will be a remarkable increase in the population of the elderly in both developed and developing countries. Many noteworthy demographic changes are taking place in developing countries alongside increasing mobility and changing family structures. Apart from that, Industrialization is modifying long standing patterns of interdependence between the generations of a family, often resulting in material and emotional hardship for the elderly who were cared for by their younger generations. The familial and social networks, which traditionally existed in many developing countries and had previously provided support to the older generation, have been weakened and often destroyed by rapid social and economic change brought about by industrialization, making the elder abuse more common and rampant. According to the World Health Organization, abuse of older people is either an act of commission or of omission, in which case it is usually described as neglect, and that it may be either intentional or unintentional. The abuse may be of a physical nature, it may be psychological, involving emotional or verbal aggression, or it may involve financial or other material maltreatment. Regardless of the type of abuse, it will certainly result in unnecessary suffering, injury or pain, the loss or violation of human rights, and a decreased quality of life for the older person. The definition developed by Action on Elder Abuse in the United Kingdom and adopted by the International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse states that elder abuse is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person. Such abuse is generally divided into the following categories. Physical abuse, the infliction of pain or injury, physical coercion, or physical or drug induced restraint. Psychological or emotional abuse, the infliction of mental anguish. Financial or material abuse, the illegal or improper exploitation or use of funds or resources of the older person. Sexual abuse, non-consensual sexual contact of any kind with the older person. Neglect, the refusal or failure to fulfill a caregiving obligation. This may or may not involve a conscious and intentional attempt to inflict physical or emotional distress on the older person. Risk factors. Following are the major risk factors associated with the elderly abuse. Individual factors. A number of factors associated with enhancing the risk of elderly abuse are associated with the individuals involved in elderly abuse. Research suggests that many personal characteristics of people involved in caregiving to the elderly are indicative of their predisposed tendency to engage in abusive behavior towards the elderly. It has been found that those individuals suffering from personality disorders are more likely to abuse the elderly than those not suffering. Also, the elderly whose care responsibilities are given to alcoholic individuals are much more likely to be abused. On the other hand, the elderly who are looked after by overwhelmed or overworked people tend to suffer neglect more than others. A number of other factors such as stress, recent diagnosis of mental illness, high levels of hostility, inadequate coping skills, exposure to abuse in the past, etc. also serve as precursors in the perpetration of abuse. Relationship factors. The relationship shared by the elderly people and their caregivers is also sometimes indicative of the likelihood of future occurrence of elderly abuse. For example, one research study found that violent acts carried out by an elderly person towards the caregiver can act as triggers for reciprocal violence by the caregiver. A number of other factors such as stress, high levels of hostility, inadequate coping skills, exposure to abuse, lack of social and formal support and caregiving, etc. reflect existence of abuse. Community and societal factors. Many social and community related factors also serve as risk factors for elderly abuse. Some cultures manifest high tolerance of aggressive behavior. In these cultures, many forms of abusive behavior, especially the mild ones like verbal abuse, neglect, social isolation, etc., are not frowned upon. In such conditions, it is highly likely that the elderly will be segregated from their peer group, their autonomy is taken away, and they are not given any decision-making power, even related to the decisions concerning their own lives. Opportunities of social interaction get minimized, and hence any abuse fails to get reported. Financial vulnerability among elderly, meaning and signs. Physical vulnerability is not the only kind of vulnerability experienced by the elderly. Another form of vulnerability is associated with the financial situation of the elderly. The elderly are at an enhanced risk of becoming victims of financial crimes. Age-associated financial vulnerability has been conceptualized as a pattern of risky money-related behavior exhibited by the elderly. Such a behavior predisposes the elderly to an increased risk of loss of their precious financial resources and savings. Owing to this substantial loss, they might experience massive changes in their quality of life. They are also at a risk of becoming dependent on unwilling adult children or other family members who in turn might view the elderly as a financial liability. Financial exploitation is one of the most common problems of elder abuse. With advancing age, the elderly are exposed to major loss of executive function and other cognitive capacities. Their thinking is not as clear and sharp as it would have been at a younger age. Their ability to make sound decisions, including financial decisions, is compromised, resulting in an increased financial vulnerability. Factors other than cognitive decline that can contribute to financial vulnerability among the elderly include physical decline like impairments in vision, hearing or mobility, severe progressive illnesses, and segregation. Certain old age disorders and medications prescribed to manage them can also speed up cognitive decline and make it harder for the elderly to manage their finances. Older women are especially vulnerable to financial abuse owing to their lower incomes and savings in comparison to men. They also tend to live longer than men and as a result are more likely to outlive their savings. Such issues commonly lead to financial insecurity and dependence in later years. Other factors contributing to financial vulnerability include low educational qualifications, low-paying jobs that lack pension benefits, and disturbed occupational record. Further, chronic illnesses and costly medical histories also scoop out a big hole in their savings, ultimately resulting in loss of financial independence. Preventive measures. Following are some of the preventive measures which can be adopted in order to safeguard the elderly against financial vulnerability. First, engaging the elderly to maximize use of government-provided funds such as elderly pension, widow pension, etc. Providing sound financial advice to the elderly so as to empower them to make profitable investments and enable them for the much required financial planning. Educating the elderly of various government schemes and initiatives of non-governmental organizations. Providing legal aid in sorting out financial matters related to money of the elderly as well as inheritance disputes. Spreading awareness about financial crimes, especially targeting the elderly and the modus operandi of the perpetrators. Increasing government and private funded research on financial exploitation of elderly individuals as well as for testing effectiveness of government policies and schemes designed to protect the elderly against exploitation. Summary: the elderly face a number of safety problems on a daily basis, with falls, burns, poisoning, and automobile accidents being the most common. The elderly are more susceptible to accidents and injuries than are younger adults because of a number of internal and external factors. Internal factors are associated with their own being and include the normal physiological changes which accompany aging, increased incidence of chronic disease, increased use of medications, and cognitive or emotional changes. External factors are associated with the environment in which the elderly dwell and include fire hazards, home security issues, and vehicular accidents. physical safety of the elderly is also threatened by falls, which become frequent because of diminishing acuity of visual and auditory senses, poor musculoskeletal functions, illnesses, decrease in strength and coordination, etc. Various factors associated with elderly abuse are individual, relationship, and community and societal factors. Elderly also experience financial vulnerability. Factors that can contribute to financial vulnerability among the elderly include cognitive or emotional decline, impairments in vision, hearing, or mobility, serious progressive illnesses, and social isolation.